Magandang araw sa inyong lahat. Welcome sa isa na namang episode ng online series ni Inang Pamantasan kung saan ang pagkatuto ay walang hangganan. Ito ang PNU Talks. Ako nga pala si Joseph Randolph Palattao, PNU B.Ed Batch 2007 at ako ang inyong Learning from Home buddy sa episode na ito. Ngayong araw ay pag-uusapan natin ang topic na ito, no? Ang Reimagining Formative Assessment for Learning Recovery. Sa buong episode na ito, huwag niyong kalimutang mag-comment o i-comment ang inyong mga katanungan at mga kuro-kuro tungkol sa ating episode ngayong araw. Huwag din kalimutang i-like at i-share ang episode natin. So, bakit nga ba ito ang topic natin ngayong araw na ito? Well, dahil na rin sa bigla tayo no na napuwersang napuwersa na mag-distance learning no nung 2020 dahil sa COVID-19. Syempre malaking isa sa mga pinakamalaking katanungan or isa sa mga pinakamainit na topic no sa mga teachers, even sa mga school heads, so basta sa buong education system ay ang paano nga ba natin masisiguro na natututo yung mga bata kahit na sila ay nasa bahay. At ngayon na unti-unti nang bumabalik no ang ating mga mag-aaral no sa mga schools, no unti-unti nang dumadami ang mga public at private schools na nag-open ulit ng kanilang mga classrooms para sa in-person learning. Gaano kahalaga pa din no ang formative assessment para masiguro natin na maka-catch up ang ating mga estudyante sa kung anumang learning loss na nangyari. Isa rin ito no sa konsepto na laging nababanggit mula pa nung nagkaroon ng mga school closures at kahit last year no syempre ang iniisip ng karamihan ay kung maraming mga bata ang nagsa-struggle na sa loob ng isang physical classroom, paano pa kaya nung distance learning? So maraming maraming concerns, maraming challenges no na lumabas no mula nung nagkaroon ng pandemic. Kaya naman ngayon na ito nga bumabalik na ulit ang mga bata sa loob ng mga classrooms no. Ano mga pwede nating magawa para ma-recover no? Matulungan natin yung mga bata na ma-recover kung ano man yung learning no na na-miss nila or kung sakali man na nawala no during the time that they were only in their homes. Okay? So, but before we even talk about a formative assessment, mahalaga mo nang tingnan natin ano ba yung situation ng Philippines no bago pa magkaroon ng pandemic. Okay? As you can see here in this graph, this shows us the comparison of PISA and TIMSS scores in East Asia and the Pacific no, since 2000 for PISA and 2003 for TIMSS. Okay? And based on the TIMSS 2003 scores, ang pinapakita nito ay nasa 69.5% or estimated at 69.5% na yung learning poverty ng bansa natin. Ano bang ibig sabihin ng learning poverty? Well, ito yung proportion or percentage of 10-year-olds who cannot read and understand a simple story. And again, the diagram that I'm showing you represents the available scores that we have no per country, and for the Philippines the data that we have is only for the TIMSS no kasi nga nag-take lang naman tayo ng PISA nitong 2018 lamang at ang report na kung saan nanggaling itong graph na to ay nirelease lang din no noong 2018 bago magkaroon ng PISA. So ibig sabihin malamang sa mga nanonood ngayon niisip nyo matagal na pala ito no pero kumusta nang kaya ngayon yung Pilipinas? Sige, tingnan natin ngayon yung tatlong international large-scale assessments na sinalihan ng Philippines itong noong 2018 at noong 2019. Umpisahan natin sa CPLM. Okay? Ang CPLM or Southeast Asia Primary Learning Metrics was first conducted in 2019 by SIMEO and UNICEF. No, ang target nito ay grade 5 students. Ibig sabihin, again, first time lang ito no na kinonduct, at sa unang run nito, meron lamang 6 no na Southeast Asian nations na sumali. Okay? And so at the end of this assessment, the average mean score of these countries was 300. Now let's look at how the Philippines fared no in each domain no in the assessment. First, sa reading literacy, the Philippines got a score of 288. So, sabihin, mas mababa siya no, sa average mean score. Kaya anong ibig sabihin nitong score na to? No? Well, base sa scaling ng CPLM, ang score na yan inangahulugan that the typical Filipino grade 5 student can read a range of everyday texts fluently. And they begin to engage their meaning. Okay? So basically, siguro isip natin, ay mukhang positive naman siya. Pero take note ha, these are grade 5 students already. So sabihin, they may be able to engage in everyday texts, a whole range or different, or yeah, a range of everyday texts. Pero nasa beginning stage lang no ng kanilang pag-engage sa meaning ng kanilang mga binabasa. Okay, so that's for reading literacy. Next, for writing literacy, also with 288, this means that the typical Filipino grade 5 student can produce very limited writing with fragmented ideas and inadequate vocabulary. Actually, when you look at the report, no, makikita niyo yung graph doon na ang laki ng proportion ng mga students natin na nasa mababang levels lang ng writing. Siguro mapaisip tayo na, what does this say about our grade 5 students? What does this say about our elementary students in general? Does this mean na hindi sanay yung mga bata sa writing? So if it's a yes for us, siguro sa manonood ng mga teachers din dito, baka sakala mapaisip din kayo no, na marami kayo siguro mga estudyante na hindi sanay magsulat no or to express their thoughts in writing. They may be able or basically they can they can write naman. Pero baka when it comes to articulating their thoughts or communicating no in writing, baka doon sila nahihirapan. And here, makikita natin na meron tayong evidence dito ngayon yan, no? Kasi nga yung average yung score natin ay mababa pa sa average score ng 6 countries na nag-take ito. And then lastly, math literacy also with 288. And as we can see here, the typical Filipino, or based on the assessment, the typical grade 5 student can apply number properties and units of measurement in English, but only at the basic levels. Okay? So dito pa lang sa CPLM, we can already see that yung performance in Philippines across these 3 literacies or across these 3 domains are already below the mean performance at the Southeast Asian level, even if we are only looking at 6 Southeast Asian countries, excluding Singapore, of course, which we know as a powerhouse or an international powerhouse when it comes to the languages, mathematics, and also the sciences. Okay. Next is the TIMS. So we have the trends in international math and science study given to grades or given to students in grades 4 and 8. No? And as I mentioned kanina, we already participated in the TIMS before, no? In 2003, and then in 2008 also. Parang kung tama recall ko din, before 2003 nag-participate rin tayo sa TIMS, no? But for this round, no, in TIMS 2019, we only participated in the grade 4 assessment. Okay? So again, as it said, no, doon sa mismong pangalan pa lang ng assessment, this international large-scale assessment looks at mathematics and science performance. So for mathematics, the Philippines got a score of 297, which is good for 58th out of 58 countries. Okay? And basically, itong score pa lang ni Philippines for mathematics is way below the low international benchmark at 400. So take note that the teams kasi has benchmarks so they has yung low up to advanced benchmarks. And para masabi na yung performance ng isang country ay at least nami-meet, no, at the minimum yung low international benchmark, dapat merong score na 400. And unfortunately, the Philippines only got a 297. So it means that basically our students, or in typical na grade 4 Filipino student, have some basic mathematical knowledge but can only but only to a limited extent. No? So they can add, subtract, multiply, and divide 1 and 2-digit whole numbers, can solve simple word problems, have some knowledge of simple fractions and common geometric shapes, and can read and complete simple bar graphs and tables. But again, etong expectations na to ay yung nakaabot ng low international benchmark. Paano pa kaya, no, kung yung mga students natin na 297 lang in general, no, yung nakuha natin na score. Now, for science grade 4, it's much lower. No? So we got 249 in this learning area or in this domain. So for low international benchmark, we can see that students show limited understanding of scientific concepts and limited knowledge of foundational science facts. No? Yun yung expectation for low international benchmark. But again, hindi ulit natin siya naabot, and it's actually very, very far, no, from the cutoff score, right? And then lastly, PISA. Okay, I would like to assume na marami siguro sa inyo dito ang nakarinig na, no, nitong PISA, no? Especially nung unang lumabas yung results nito nung 2019. No? So the PISA stands for the Program for International Student Assessment, which targets 15-year-olds, no, and it assesses 3 domains: okay, reading, mathematics, and science. Okay, in 2018, the main focus of the assessment was on reading, while itong upcoming na PISA 2022, the focus will be on mathematics. So now let's just focus on our performance in PISA 2018. As you can see here, for reading literacy, the OECD average was 487, which is just equivalent to level 3 performance. But for the Philippines, we only got 340, good for only level 1A. Now, what does level 1A mean or stand for? Well, this means that the typical 15-year-old Filipino student can understand the literal meaning of sentences or short passages, recognize the main theme, and make a single connection between several adjacent pieces of information. For math literacy, we can see here that our score is higher than reading, but when it comes to the set levels or benchmarks, we're below level 1. It means that for level 1, it's expected that students can perform direct and straightforward mathematical tasks. Okay? But dahil below level 1 pa tayo, sabihin, problematic din ito, no, for even for our 15-year-olds. No? So kahit yung mga simple arithmetic calculations with whole numbers, kailangan clear pa and well-defined yung instructions before they can even perform well for that certain or in that certain task. Okay, and then lastly, science. So OECD level is 489, again equivalent to level 3, and we got a score of 357, good only for level 1A, which means that the typical 15-year-old Filipino student can use basic science knowledge to recognize or identify explanations of scientific phenomena and do structured scientific inquiries with at most 2 variables. And so please take note that there were actually 78 countries that participated in the PISA, although for reading, an account na dyan ay 77 countries. And sadly, for reading, we ranked last. Okay, and then for math and science, we only ranked second to the last. Okay, so this tells us that across these three international large-scale assessments, so yung CPLM for grade 5, TIMSS for grade 4, and PISA for 15-year-olds, mababa yung naging performance natin. Okay? So ang tanong ngayon is, kung babalikan natin yung figure na pinakita ko sa inyo sa umpisa when I started this session, pero baka inisip nyo ngayon, hala, kung yung sa graph pala before ay ano pa yun yung dati pa na available data set yung kinonsider doon at mababa na our learning poverty rate was already 69.5%. Paano pa kaya ngayon kapag finactor in yung performance natin dito sa tatlong assessments na to? And take note na ginawa ito prior to the pandemic, So ibig sabihin, nitong nag-pandemic na na-force yung lahat ng bata na mag-aral at home, Tapos syempre dahil nga sa maraming challenges, yung distance learning, ano na kaya ang nangyari sa competencies ng mga students natin? Possible kaya na naging better sa mga estudyante yung situation na baka naging mas okay kaya yung situation na nasa bahay na sila nag-aaral or what? Well, if we look at the best available research out there, especially those in those countries na merong systematic research on school closures, even before the pandemic, we have to take note that prolonged school closures have been known to exacerbate whatever academic and social inequalities that have been existing already. And so kapag mas mahaba pa o pag humaba pa further yung school closures, such situations widen their impact on schooling and well-being outcomes. So ano ba yung mga situations na nagkakaroon ng mga school closure? Syempre sa atin mas naging familiar tayo dun sa pandemic, Pero even before nagkakaroon naman na talaga ng mga school closures, hindi lang siya ganun na kasing haba na tulad nitong pandemic. So for example, sa mga war-torn areas, Syempre hindi naman pwedeng basta lang na mag-open pa rin yung school, so school operations are affected, pag mga bumabagyo, ganyan, di ba nagsususpend ng classes, and definitely in some areas or in some countries this could take not only a few days, but maybe this can happen in weeks, or maybe more than 1 month, So syempre meron na ring impact yun on whatever learning outcomes na gustong ma-attain for our children. And so dahil nga meron na tayong pre-existing na learning poverty rate or high learning poverty rate at 69.5%, kasagkaroon pa ng prolonged school closures mula nung March 2020 up to the late 2021, and even up to now, especially for those schools na until now ay hindi pa nakaka-participate sa face-to-face classes. Well, it is to be expected na talagang mas tataas yung learning poverty rate ng Philippines. And according to the World Bank calculations, as of August 2021, learning poverty rate in the Philippines has risen to as much as 90%. Okay? And you can see it here dun sa nilabas na article na rin ng Inquirer that 9 out of 10 kids here in the Philippines who are actually 10-year-olds, just to add, cannot actually read or even comprehend what they are reading, right? And so even if kung hihimayin pa din natin ano ba yung mga nakaka-affect doon sa distance learning, we also have another set of data here, which shows us the top 3 barriers to effective learning. And these top 3 barriers basically are the following: limited access to gadgets and internet, the child's inability to focus, and stress due to COVID-19. Okay. And so if we consider yung pre-existing na learning poverty rate natin dito sa Philippines, Tapos i-match pa natin siya dito ngayon, no, sa mga barriers na to effective distance learning. This really highlights, no, or this really aligns, no, or concretizes whatever observations have been made already by a lot of experts, no. And so as you can see here, let me just read, no, emerging data suggests that take up of remote learning during school closures was lower for countries that already had high rates of learning poverty. So ibig sabihin, hindi na rin naging surprising itong situation na to. Dahil nga mataas na yung learning poverty rate natin bago pa mag-pandemic. So, syempre, slower, no, yung take up, no, or yung expected na impact ng remote learning during school closures when everyone else and when both students and teachers are having instructional experiences at home. Okay? So, what's the current context? We know that more than 26,000 schools nationwide have already resumed face-to-face classes. No? Combined na to na public and private schools. So, ang mga private schools around 700 and ang public schools nasa 25,700. So that's more than 26,000. Okay, so as we try to return to a sense of normalcy by starting to or progressively, opening up our schools, no, para mag-receive ng mga students ulit, no, for in-person learning, there are a lot of questions that we need to ask, no. And when I say we, it's not only the teachers, no, but this include school heads, supervisors, the parents, and all other educational leaders and all other, no, every education stakeholder, no, that has a parang meron siyang concern about how to make sure that yung mga bata ay matutong muli, no, pagbalik nila sa mga classrooms. No? So there are a lot of questions that we need to ask. So immediately after schools reopen, we should ask ourselves the following. So number one, what do students know and are able to do when they return to school? Okay, so for example, if based on evidence, we know that our students are performing well, no, nung nasa bahay pa lang sila. This is the time to make sure really na kung ano yung performance sila when they're at home ay katulad din, no, or magiging katulad din siya ng performance pagdating sa classroom, or kung sakali man baka nga better pa, no, kung sakali man na mababa yung performance when they were just at home. So one, again, it's important to determine what they know, they understand, and what they are able to do. Okay. Secondly, how can teachers align instruction to ensure that all students are learning at the right level? Okay. Hindi lang to basta scores ang pinag-uusapan. Take note that we have to highlight the phrase at the right level. Okay? Parang pinakita ko sa inyo kanina, di ba, dun sa mga international large-scale assessments. Porket sinabi na, okay, the Philippines got a score of 287 and then or 297, and then the Philippines is last among 58 countries. Hindi na siya nagsastop sa ganun eh. Anong ibig sabihin nung score ng 297? And we really have to to start thinking ng ganun yung mindset natin, no? If our students get a score of, let's say, 40 out of 50, what does a score of 40 out of 50 mean? Okay? Of course, hindi lang siya yung sinasabi natin na 40 correct answers out of 50. That's not what I really mean. Pero anong ibig sabihin nun in relation to the curriculum expectations? Anong sinasabi nun sa level of attainment ng bata ng content and performance standards and even the learning competencies? Okay? So, once we are able to identify kung ano yung level, no, ng mga student performance, And that's the only time can teachers align their instruction, no, with their students' performance. Then number 3, how can education leaders direct resources to schools, teachers, and students who need them the most? Definitely, again, prior to the pandemic, we recognize that there were already existing inequalities, hindi lang academic, no, but also social, no, and even other even in other dimensions, no, related to learning outcomes, no, kahit sa gender, no, iba yung performance ng male and female, no. So how can the schools make sure that these inequalities are not exacerbated, no? Hindi siya nawa-widen further. So definitely, kung nag-widen man siya nitong pandemic, ngayon bumabalik na ulit yung mga bata, what can we do para ma-bridge itong gap na to? Okay? Ano yung mga resources na kailangan nating i-provide at sino-sino yung mga dapat tumanggap nito? If we have, let's say, 30 students in the class or even 15 in a class na nakasama sa face-to-face setup, yung bang 50 na to ay nangangailangan lahat, no, na mabigyan nitong same kind of resource, no, or kailangan kailangan differentiated pa din? And if yes, how can we differentiate these resources? So how can we differentiate our instruction, no, for our students? And the same goes for our teachers. So anong klaseng differentiated support ang kailangan nila so that they can cater to the different levels of ability, no, ng mga students na meron sila, especially this school year. Now, throughout the school year, ito naman yung mga dapat itanong natin. So number 1, are students making adequate progress in their learning since reopening? Okay, so kanina pinakita ko, di ba, immediately after schools reopen, we have to find out what the students know and what our students know and are able to do. No? So ito naman, so the school year, we have to find out whether they are making adequate progress, no, from whatever starting point, no, or whatever baseline data that we have. No? And then secondly, are students catching up with their pre-COVID-19 learning levels or learning trajectories and improving once that level has been reached? Okay, so again, babalikan natin yung second question kanina. We have to determine kung ano ba yung levels of performance, no, ng mga students natin, and whether they are actually making enough progress towards the expected levels that you have for that certain grade level. Okay? So, with these questions in mind, it's important for every teacher to think of himself or herself as a learning detective. Now, what do we mean by being a learning detective? Well, ano ba trabaho ng isang detective? Diba? To search for clues, no? To search for evidence. And so, it's important for teachers as learning detectives to make full use of assessment to gather, no, to gather information about student learning. No? So it's about identifying, gathering, organizing, and interpreting both quantitative and qualitative information about what learners know, understand, and can do. Okay? This is the definition of classroom assessment in Independent Order number 8, Series 2015, okay? Which encapsulates the wide variety of information that we should get, no, to make sure that we have a good picture of our learners' competencies, no? Both in terms of content and with what they can do with those content and how they can transfer their learning, no, in various situations. So assessment must be treated as a range of activities that is undertaken, that are undertaken by teachers, learners, and their peers that provide feedback to support teaching and learning. So take note that assessment is not just a tool, no, that you prepare or maybe you download from the internet and then you just administer to your pupils. No, hindi siya dapat ganun. No, so basically from the start of your lesson up to the end of your lesson, we should always be doing assessment. We should always be assessing our students. So whether is instructional in nature or talagang intentional na assessment ng isang activity, definitely such activities provide useful information that we can use to modify our teaching and thereby improve learning outcomes. And so, going back to what I said kanina, ano bang ibig sabihin ng detective? Detectives always look for evidence, and so if we consider ourselves as learning detectives, then it's important for us to continuously search for evidence of learning, okay, at different stages of the lesson, within the lesson or even between lessons. Okay, and when we talk about evidence, syempre dapat reliable yun, at pag sinabing reliable evidence, dapat directly observable. Ngayon, maraming concerns nitong nag-pandemic at nasa bahay lang yung mga students na paano ko masisiguro na yung student ko yung gumagawa ng outputs niya? Baka naman yung parents niya yung sasagot o yung mga kapatid o yung whoever na guardian na kasama niya. Definitely that's really that's really something that every teacher should be concerned about, Kasi nga naman baka yung binibigyan mo na ng score hindi yung student mo but yung someone na nagsagot para doon sa student mo. So syempre we really have to rethink how we can construct our assessment such that it will provide information or directly observable information or direct observable traits about our students' learning. Okay, so for example, kung nasanay lang tayo na nagbibigay tayo lagi ng multiple choice questions, then definitely malaking issue yun kung yun lang bibigay nyo pa din or binibigay nyo pa din nung distance learning. Kasi madaling sagutan ang ang ABCD. So how will you make sure or how will you find out whether their answer in letter A is really their answer? How will you know that they have reached a sufficient level of understanding that help them arrive at an answer of letter A, B, C, or D? Okay? So, ibig sabihin, kailangan yung pinapagawa natin sa mga students will help us determine or see what learners do, say, make, or write. Okay, so basically ito yung template natin. So kung mag-iisip kayo lagi ng assessments sa inyong for your students, these assessments should yield information about what learners can do, say, make, or write. They should all be directly observable. Okay? And so, when we now plan our assessments, especially in content, yung mga assessments natin, we have to be careful kung ano yung mga ina-assess natin, Kasi baka mamaya kung ano lang yung tingin nating lumalabas sa mga tests, or kunyari sa sobrang pagmamadali natin sa pagtuturo sa mga students natin, konti lang yung ini-include, yung ina-assess natin, yung i-include natin sa mga sa binibigay natin ng mga assessment activities. And so what happens is that this sends a different message to our pupils in such a way that they only see ngayon yung mga content ng assessment as those that are the only ones important in that subject. So yun yung tinatawag natin na backwash. And kapag ganun yung nangyari, that might be a negative backwash, or in some literature they also call it washback naman, So merong positive and negative na effects yun. Of course, on the positive side, mas mabibigyan ng focus or ng attention, ano ba yung mga key areas within the discipline na kailangan tutukan talaga, which is crucial for later grades, But how about naman yung negative, yung negative implications itong mga to? Syempre, baka isipin lang ng bata na, ay sige, yan lang yung aralin natin kasi yan lang naman yung laging tinatanong ni teacher. Kaya naman pag nakita niya puro multiple choice lang yung items, ay isipin niya na, sige, ano na lang ako, mag-memorize na lang ako kasi never ko namang nakita si teacher or na-experience sa si teacher nagpa-essay sa exam niya. So again, our own assessment practices send different messages to our students. Okay? And so it's really important that when we assess our students, it covers a wide range of competencies, no? So that balance din, no, yung ano natin, magiging judgment about our students' performance at the end of a certain instructional period. Now, I just mentioned, no, kanina, that assessment is a continuous search for evidence of learning. But take note that it is a process, no, that is not or should not be considered in isolation of all the other dimensions, no, or considerations in the classroom, like curriculum, like pedagogical approaches, learning theories. No? Of course, these three flow into the planning and the design, no? Yung mga classroom experiences or mga learning experiences. And so when we now plan these experiences, kailangan side by side, no, makita natin yung interaction niya, or we have to take note of how these instructional and assessment experiences interact with each other. And so it's important to highlight that assessment is indeed the bridge between, no, teaching and learning. But it is more relevant, no, for us to understand that while it serves, no, as a bridge, no, or it bridges the gaps, no, in teaching and learning, then it is vital that we also look at assessment as part of the pedagogical process. Okay, assessment as pedagogy itself, right? So if that's our if that's our perspective, then it's also crucial that we assess our students within a developmental framework. In Depend Order number 8, Series 2015, it says there that at the heart of the assessment framework is the recognition and deliberate consideration of the learner's zone of proximal development. So here in this diagram, you can see here a visualization of what the ZPD means. Okay, and just to put this simply, or just to help you, para understand this diagram, imagine that you are trying to learn to ride the bicycle for the very first time. So definitely, babagsak ka, no, many times, no, until siguro yung parent mo or yung kapatid mo tutulungan ka na mag-ride ng bicycle habang hawak niya yung manibela. So yung assistance na binibigay sa iyo, sabihin yun yung yun yung papunta ka na, or you're within the zone of proximal development, no? Kasi you are being given the assistance, no, by a knowledgeable other. Okay, so pwedeng sa mga susunod na mga instances, no, bumibitiw na yung guardian mo doon sa manibela, and you can now ride your bicycle, no, for a few meters, no, for 100 meters and so on, no, until dumating sa point na master mo na siya, na wala na yung help, no, nung guardian mo or nung knowledgeable other na kasama mo, and so you can now ride the bike independently, no? So inside the classroom, it's important for us to determine ito nga yung mga levels, no, nasaan yung ZPD ng mga bata, no, ano yung nasaan, no, yung zone, no, kung saan may 50% chance na maging successful yung mga students. Okay? So maybe you're thinking, this sounds abstract to me. How can I do this in the class? This sounds technical to me. Do I need a standardized test to do this? Well, not necessarily, no? Ang kailangan mo lang talaga meron kang deep understanding ng developmental progressions nung tinuturo mo. So if you're teaching mathematics, dapat alam mo, pag tinuro mo yung isang competency, no, or yung isang standard, kaya mo siyang i-break down into different levels, no, from low to high proficiency. Okay, so ibig sabihin, bago niya ma-achieve, no, yung let's say level 5, no, dapat naintindihan niya muna or na-achieve niya muna yung level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4, up to level 5. In other words, parang stairs lang yan, no? Para makaakyat ka to the next level, you have to go through these steps. Okay? Saan ba manggagaling itong mga steps na to? If it's criterion referencing, then definitely sa curriculum guide natin. Okay? So, sabihin, as a classroom teacher, when you look at the curriculum guide, you should be well equipped, no, to unpack, no, the standards when needed, or if the standards are sufficiently unpacked already, baka naman kailangan merong mga learning competencies ka na i-join together, no? Lalo na kung you think na medyo kinakapos ka sa oras, limited lang yung time mo dahil nga sa current face-to-face setup ay konti lang yung students na hawak ninyo, and then the rest are still on remote learning. So how can you maximize the time that you have with your students? So definitely, you will have to strategize. You will have to be more intentional in designing your lessons, in designing your instructional activities and even the assessment activities. Okay? And so, babalikan natin ngayon yung pinaka-familiar tayo na taxonomy, which is yung Bloom's taxonomy. Okay? So this is one way of helping you concretize so yung understanding ninyo about these progressions. So syempre, para nga naman makapag-analyze yung bata, you should be able to na master muna yung levels ng remembering, understanding, and applying before you ask them to analyze a certain text or a certain task. Right? So, just going back, so when we say search for evidence of learning, take note that we have to consider 4 criteria. Okay, I will just be mentioning this very quickly. So number 1, yung assessment ay dapat appropriate. So is the evidence the right kind for making the decisions to be made? Is it supportive of the inference to be drawn from the data? And is it even ethical to gather these data? Second, adequacy. Okay. Do we have enough evidence to make the conclusion that we wish to make? So bago nyo sabihin na, okay, na-master na ng students ko yung itong performance standard. What makes you say that they have mastered this already? Do you have enough evidence? O baka naman nag-base ka lang sa isang assessment, tapos multiple choice pa siya. Tapos yung performance standard nyo is to write a paragraph on. So how can you say that they are able to write a paragraph kung hindi ka naman nagpapa-essay? Diba? Kung puro lang ang binibigay natin ay written tasks, okay, pero puro selective responses lang naman or yung item format na binibigay natin, diba? So basically hindi siya adequate na support for our judgments or inferences, which also affects number 3, yung accuracy. What efforts are being made to control the noise in the data? If you provide, let's say, constructed response items or yung mga open-ended tasks, syempre, kung wala kang rubric, magva-vary yung ways of scoring mo across outputs. So definitely, yung mood mo kapag nag-check ka ng mga outputs will affect yung mga scores, pati syempre yung perception mo about the or the different perceptions that you have about your students while you are marking their outputs. So you have to consider ano yung mga non-learning related factors. Ito yung sabihin ng noise that would affect how you assess or even mark student outputs. Have the influences of learner behavior been controlled also? Are teacher attitudes to the assessment taken into account? And maybe there are other factors that you also need to consider. And has the process of collecting the data been controlled also? So kunyari nito nga pag nag-summative assessment tayo, nasa sa bahay yung bata, si teacher, syempre nasa malayo din sa mga estudyante niya. Gusto mag-summative assessment ni teacher. Paano niya gagawin yun kung malayo sa kanyang student? So paano kung magbibigay siya ng 25 items na written quiz or unit test, ibibigay niya sa through Google form? How can the teacher make sure na kapag binigay niya yung link, yung student lang talaga yung nagsasagot nung quiz na yon or test? Wala, hindi siya tinutulungan ng anyone. So again, such processes can also affect how accurate our assessments can be. And then lastly, authenticity. Can it be verified that the evidence is linked directly to the person being assessed? sabihin, baka nga, yun nga, ano na rin, related na rin sa accuracy, baka naman may ibang taong gumagawa nito. Or, kung siya man mismo gumawa nito, enough ba yung ginawa niya to show that yung kanyang performance is really authentic, no? It's really linked to real-world setups, so to real-world performance. Is there a method or process to ensure that the evidence is actually produced by that person? Okay, so again, these are lots of questions that we need to consider, no, across these four criteria. And so when we think about our assessments and integrative assessment for that matter, we have to consider three practices or three approaches. Number one, intradisciplinarity, meaning integration within their discipline, no, or the extent to which our students can apply what they know and understand within the learning area. Second is interdisciplinarity, the extent to which the students can transfer their learning or apply, you know, their understandings across disciplines. Let's say, yung inaral niya sa, or yung natutunan niya sa math, kaya niya ma-apply sa science, no? Or there's a certain assessment that integrates competencies in math, English, and araling panlipunan. So this is interdisciplinarity. Okay. And then lastly, intercontextuality. No, the extent to which students can apply, what they have learned across contexts. And what do we mean by context? Well, it could be, for example, like ito nangyari sa public, sa COVID-19, no, public health ba yung issue? Economic, social, political, or maybe cultural. No? In terms of context, the context may be personal, occupational, scientific, educational, local, national, or even global. Like, again, COVID-19, it's a global issue. Okay? Or even cultural. Sorry, I forgot to show it a while ago. So even cultural. So there are various contexts na pwedeng mag-shape, no, pwedeng nating gamitin when we construct our assessments. And so when we look at the link, no, between teaching, learning, and assessment, again, we need to ask ourselves the following questions. So, para ma-determine natin ano ba yung pinaka-purpose ng pag-assess natin. So what should my students know, understand, and be able to do? How can I translate the standards into specific teachable components? What do my students already know about the topic I'm about to teach? And how can my students express what they have learned? So remember that when we try, to help our students regain, or at least recover, for whatever learning gaps, na na-experience nila. Tapos considering pa na limited lang yung time na meron tayo with our students, always remember that we remember what we think about most. Let me repeat that. We remember what we think about most. So in relation to the information processing model, we have to make sure that there's constant practice in whatever we are asking our students to do or whatever we are doing with our students. Okay, we have to help them parang store, their learnings in the short-term memory, and then sundan siya ng maraming practice para ma-encode siya ngayon sa long-term memory. This is very important, in the long run, kasi paano kapag kunwari magkaroon ulit ng school closures, definitely our students will have to depend on what they have retained, in their long-term memory, and that will only happen when there's constant practice. Okay, but we also have to take note that there's what we call cognitive load theory, that there's a limit to how much new information that the human brain can process at a time, especially for younger children. So hindi porket sinabing learning recovery ay sa isang upuan o sa isang lesson lang pagkasabay-sabay natin yung napakarami ng mga competencies. So definitely that's going to be unproductive, not only for you, but especially for you as a teacher, but especially for the student. Mapo-frustrate lang sila. Baka susunod na araw ayaw na nila ulit pumasok because they will feel frustrated, even depressed. They will feel na hindi sila competent enough, no, to succeed, no, dun sa classroom. Okay? Then secondly, there are no known limits to how much stored information can be processed at a time. So ibig sabihin, yung activities na ginagawa natin, must make sure na matap niya yung mga prerequisite skills, no, so that si teacher din ma-connect din yung mabuti doon sa ano yung mga dapat matutunan at that moment ng mga students. Okay? So, with these in mind, I'm now going to share with you some practical approaches or strategies. Para yung formative assessment nyo ay talagang maging effective, no, in the classroom. Because again, formative assessment is now critical more than ever. Okay? Ngayon, ang ano lang dyan, we now have to reflect din kasi, no, na while formative assessment is more critical now, hindi ibig sabihin, no, na pag bumabalik na ngayon sa classroom yung mga bata, yung mga usual ways of teaching and assessing our students ay dapat bumalik din. Kung marami na tayong natutunan itong past 2 years about how we can teach our students better, how we can assess our students better, then the more that we should rethink and reimagine further, no, yung ano pa yung pwede nating magawa sa mga students now that we want to catch up, no? We want to have them catch up on their learnings, no? We want to support, no, their further learning, no, so that at least kung ano man yung mga nawala, no, yung mga hindi nila natutunan, no, at a deeper level when they were learning at home, at least sa classroom dito natin masusuportahan yung mga yon. So the first the first approach or the first strategy is assessment through universal response. Siguro baka technical yung wording sa inyo or baka you're not familiar with this, but primarily ginagawa niyo na rin naman ito sigurado. Kahit ako, ginagawa ko rin ito before, nagtuturo pa ako, no, sa public school. For example, yung gumagamit ng hand signals. Okay? So we can use yung FES, no? Meaning this topic is new to me and I need more information before I make a choice. And then one finger, meaning I completely disagree and can offer several reasons to support my opinion or position. 2 fingers, I disagree. Take note, yung 1 finger, completely disagree. Yung second or yung 2 fingers, I disagree and can offer 1 reason. 3 fingers, I am unsure of where I stand on this issue and I'm interested in hearing from others. 4 fingers, I agree with this statement and can offer 1 reason to support my position. 5 fingers, I completely agree and can offer several reasons. Take note na kung isipin nyo, para siyang scale. Diba? Na from, actually parang Likert scale siya eh. Kasi from the first finger or from 1 finger to 5 fingers, diba? Kasi from completely disagree to completely agree. Pero ito tinawag na universal response kasi this is something that you can ask your students to do at the same time as a whole class. So makita mo kung sino yung mga nakataas ng FES, no, na talagang bago sa kanila yung topic na yon. So definitely kung bago sa kanila, hindi pwedeng mabilisan yung pacing mo, no, with your activities, no, or with the pacing of the whole lesson. Okay? Makita mo yung iba na mayroong nakataas na 1, may nakataas na 2, nakataas na 3. So you can now make on-the-spot modifications, no, to your lesson. Kahit na may nakaplano ka na, may naka-design ka na for that certain period, definitely by seeing, no, yung hands ng mga bata, you can determine kung anong general na pacing mo for that lesson. Anong klase mga activities yung ibibigay mo for which group of students. Okay? Sample techniques also include response cards, okay, and then also polling. No, siyempre pag nagpo-poll, dito gagamit kayo ng technology. No, if it's even available in your class, then you might want to maximize the use of technology when doing such formative assessment. Okay, and then yeah, so what are some key points when using assessments through universal response? So number one, universal responses offer ways for learners to engage students in the cognitive processes of rehearsal and retrieval. Again, na-mention ko kanina, di ba? Sa information processing theory, students need a lot of practice para ma-rehearse, para ma-embed sa short-term memory and eventually sa long-term memory, yung inaaral nila. And then, para mas madali yung retrieval from the long-term memory later on. The second, frequent universal responses promote active learning and give insight into what is taking instructionally and what isn't. And thirdly, non-verbal responses, polling, and waterfall chats. Pag sabing waterfall chats, for example, yung magbibigay ka ng certain question about what they have learned, and then, well, maganda to pag gumagamit ka ng technology, no? And then sabi mo sa kanila, when I say go, click on send. So pag pinigay mo na yung question, magta-type sila ng responses, then pag-click nila ng send, dadagsa ngayon yung lahat ng mga responses. Kaya siya sinabing waterfall chat. Okay? So these techniques ensure that feedback opportunities are extended to the entire class, not only individuals. No? So this is very different from the common practice na bibigay ka ng questions, papataas ka ng kamay lang. So syempre, I will always argue na baka yung magtataas ng kamay lang, sila lang yung confidence sumagot doon sa tanong ni teacher. Paano naman yung mga di nakataas ang kamay? Ibig sabihin ba nun ay hindi nila alam yung lesson? Or posibleng nahihiya lang sila pero alam nila. Diba? So, you have to find ways para ma-engage yung mga students. No? Again, what we're aiming for is maximum participation, maximum engagement. Okay? You have to make sure that our activities are inclusive, and differentiated, for everyone. All right. Next is teach back. Pag sinabing teach back, to put it simply, nagturo si teacher at ang role ni student ay i-teach yun pabalik kay teacher or i-teach yun sa isang kasama niya. So for example, class teach back. So nagturo si teacher, ang task niya ngayon is for the students to maybe record a 2-minute video or 2-minute video clip, explaining a certain concept, tapos yung video clip na yon pag sinend, maybe the following day as part of homework, if you view yun ng mga ibang classmates, para makita rin nila, okay, ito pala yung understanding ng classmate ko, and now I have a question kasi parang may misconception ako, I want to be clarified about this. So magta-type siya ngayon ng question. So that's one. Another is teach back to the family. So kung blended yung setup, so pwedeng sa school, magtuturo si teacher, and then as part of homework, kailangan ma-explain ng student dun sa family niya or dun sa parents niya ano ba yung natutunan niya sa araw na yon. And then si parent pwedeng mag-take ng video while their children are explaining the concept. Tapos yung video din na yun na isisend pabalik kay teacher para makita rin ng teacher yung ginawang teach back ng student na yun. Okay. And then also already related to the previous two, retelling to teach others. So for example, there's a story na binasa, So syempre, magandang malaman kung ano yung natindihan ng student sa story na yon by retelling that story to others. Pero syempre, kailangan pa nag-retell, may kasama rin tong rubric to determine or to identify kung alin sa mga certain criterion yung nami-miss out ng student. And then, students can also be asked to create their own podcasts. At yung mga podcast na to ay hindi naman kailangan mga 1 hour or 2 hours. So kahit mga 5 minutes lang. Again, ang aim lang dito is to help the students solidify their understanding by explaining what they have learned during the day. And then you also have written summaries. Okay? This is similar to, let's say, mga 3-2-1 na questioning. And then also clarity questions. What am I learning today? Why am I learning this? And how will I know that I have learned it? So pwedeng yung clarity questions ibigay ni teacher, and then pwede siyang pwede siyang sagutin ng bata, pwede makipag-partner yung isang student with another student, then they will share their responses with each other to these questions. Okay? And then another thing or other formative assessment that you can use is assessment through composing. Again, take note dun sa CPLM, mababa ang performance natin when it comes to writing. So it would be good that not only for summative assessment but also for formative assessment, no, na ma-engage natin, no, yung bata sa frequent writing exercises. But of course, guided by either holistic rubrics like this, no, or analytic rubrics now like this, para din alam nila how they can improve on their writing, on their writing tasks. Okay, so for example, ito, pwedeng mag-start with generative sentences. No? Write a sentence where the word atom is in the third position in a sentence that is at least 7 words long. No? So as you can see here, pwedeng mag-start siya dito. So ito yung describe ng task. Then pag okay na yan, pwedeng mag-move sa next, no? Using the word bond naman, kailangan fourth siya dun sa statement, and then not more than 8 words naman. Diba? And so on. No? So at least kahit na paunti-unti lang napapractice yung mga students, so how they can how they can express, no, their understanding about that certain concept or word, no, given a certain number, no, of words. Ang iba, meron din akong nakausap before, ang ginagawa niya, parang ginagaya niya yung sa Twitter. Di ba? Twitter, limited lang yung number of words, no? So at the end of the day, this teacher asks his students, no, to consolidate, no, or to make a summary of what they have learned today in not more than 100 words or sometimes not more than 150 words. Okay? So at least paunti-unti napapractice nga, no, yung mga students. Okay? And then we can also use annotations, no, or can help them use annotations, no, to help guide their writing assessments or even reading reading tasks, no. So tatlong approaches diyan: underlining key ideas, circling words and phrases that are confusing, and also creating marginal notes. Okay, and then we can also do a 5-word summary, no, wherein the students read a piece of text and independently choose 5 words that represent the reading, and then si student na to may partner siya, let's say seatmate niya, and then they will reach a consensus on a new list of 5 words. So take note, let's say ako, meron akong 5 words na napili dun sa text, and then yung katabi ko, meron din siyang 5 words. So pag nag-partner kami, when we pair up, we will reach to a consensus, or we will reach a consensus na meron kaming new list of 5 words na lang, hindi 10 words, but a new list of 5 words that we have co-constructed. And then we will join naman another pair. So meaning 4 na ngayon, no? And we will reach a consensus again, or we will reach an agreement to have a final 5-word list, no, that represents the text that we have read. And then using that final 5-word list, each one of us now will create our own written summary of the text or whatever that we have learned during the day. Okay, so that's a 5-word summary. At least concise lang siya kasi sometimes our students tend to explain so much na minsan napupunta sa iba't ibang ibang places yung mga concepts, no. So this also will also teach them how to be more concise, no, in their thoughts. Okay, so just to round up what formative assessment really is. Whatever we do in the classroom, if it's formative, no, in nature, then the assessment should be able to answer 3 key questions. No? Number 1, where's the learner going? Where's the learner right now? And how will the learner get there? Okay, so answers to these questions are not limited to the activities na ginagawa lang ni teacher. Okay, take note, that assessment is a shared responsibility among the teachers, the learners, and even the parents. So everyone in the classroom, everyone has a stake, no, doon sa learning process, and so everyone should be involved in the whole formative assessment process. Okay, so for example, to answer the question, where is the learner going? Dapat sa start pa lang ng lesson, whether this is in person or whether distance learning yung set up, dapat clear sa mga bata ano ba yung mga learning targets and ano ba yung mga criteria by which their learnings will be evaluated or judged. No? So kailangan ma-share yun ng mga teachers sa umpisa pa lang. So hindi lang siya dapat nasa lesson plan, di ba? Nakasulat doon na at the end of the lesson, the students should be able to. So pagdating sa lesson mismo, nakaharap mo ng mga students mo, you should be able to share with them that at the end of this lesson, this is what you should be able to do. So from the learner's perspective, they should be able to read the learning targets using I can statements. No? For example, kung ang learning target mo ay add similar fractions. No? Para yung learning target siya, when it's written from the learner's perspective, dapat mabasa siya ngayon as I can add simple fractions, or I can subtract dissimilar fractions. I can solve word problems involving addition and subtraction of fractions. So again, when you share learning targets, it always has to be from the perspective of the students, so that para magkaroon sila ng ownership, no, dun sa pag-aaral nila. Okay? And then for the second question, where is the learner right now? Of course, sa side the teacher has to elicit useful evidences of learning. Okay? And then to answer the question, how will the learner get there? Using the evidence gathered previously, kailangan magamit niya yon to provide timely and effective feedback to the students. Okay? But again, because assessment is a shared responsibility, self and peer assessments should also be part of the assessment design in the classroom. So teachers will have to make sure that learners are engaged in assessing and improving each other's work. No? And then also, meron ding opportunities for students to introspect, no, to metacognize, no, what they're doing in the class, no, because at least this will help support, no, their accountability, no, dun sa kanilang pag-aaral, and also again increasing their ownership of their own learning, right? So when we talk about formative assessment, this is not just something that you do at the end of the lesson, okay? It's something that you do within the lesson, meaning in every part of the lesson. Okay? So, effective formative assessment happens when intentional, no, by design, no, yung pag-assess mo sa students mo before the lesson, during the lesson, and after the lesson. Okay? And in between, no, these sections of learning, you should be able to interpret right away, no, yung information na nakukuha mo from your students and adjust right away, no, your instruction. Even when you are kahit nagmamadali ka in your lessons, kailangan mabilis kang mag-adjust, no, and you have to make sure na nakaka-cope ka, no, doon sa ano yung needs ng mga bata mo. Okay? This is also what we mean by intentional teaching, no? Kaya kailangan by design, ito yung naka-allot mo ng mga activities para ma-determine mo talaga whether your students are learning or not, no, within the lesson. And then after every lesson, kailangan din ma-connect mo, no, meron ding formative assessment pa din, no, between lessons. So pagpunta mo sa the following day sa lesson 2 mo, kailangan ma-link mo doon sa lesson 2 yung lesson 1. And then when you now teach the third lesson, dapat ma-connect mo rin yung lesson 1 and lesson 2 nila, and so on and so forth, until you reach the summative assessment stage. So again, everything here must be intentional, right? So how can we maximize the power of assessment, no? Especially that we want to help our students achieve their learning targets, coming from a distance learning setup. So number one, of course, you have to choose a most essential learning competency or a cluster of related competencies, where appropriate. So for example, let's say I'm gonna choose this set of competencies. Take note that I'm taking this example from a sample material published by the Assessment Curriculum Technology Research Center in the University of the Philippines. We're partnering in a formative assessment course, and part of that course is a guidebook, for self-learning module writers. So this example was taken from that material. So again, just going back. So here's an example of a content standard, a performance standard, and most essential learning competencies. And then so it's vital that when you have chosen a most essential learning competency, the next thing to do is, of course, to identify the related milks, and corresponding content and performance standards from earlier grades. Again, even when you are teaching grade 5 students, it's very vital that you also understand where they're coming from, or where they, o kung ano saan ang galing, yung mga targets, na dapat natutunan na nila. So definitely you will have to look back, sa grade 4 competencies or even grade 3 competencies. Okay? And then next is to look for related competencies and standards from later grades or quarters. So again, kung grade 5 tinuturuan mo, tapos first quarter, huwag ka lang maging concerned dun sa moment lang na yun, na concern mo lang, ay sige, first quarter, grade 5, that's it. Kung titingnan natin yung mga competencies or related competencies sa earlier grades or earlier quarters, the more that the same also goes to identifying related competencies sa mga later grades or quarters. Okay? Now, baka iniisip nyo, bakit? Ba't ko kailangan gawin yan? So that you can see their articulation and you can readily identify their connections to each other. Okay? And so, using that ngayon, pwede ka ngayon makagawa ng tinatawag natin na teaching and assessment blueprint. So this blueprint will help you see, at least nakalatag lang siya, will help you plan different activities according to the different levels of competence expected of learners. Okay? So basically, these descriptions summarize what learners should be able to do, say, make, and or write. Okay? So let me just show you these 4 levels. So the lowest level is, of course, the prerequisite level, describing the expected competence of learners before teaching has started. Next is progressing, okay, which is of course higher than the prerequisite level, which describes the competence attained by the learners towards the milks but have not learned everything they need to yet. Meaning, again, may tuturo ka na competency, kailangan mong ma-visualize. Well, of course, una, kailangan mo na ma-identify yung prerequisites, from the previous quarter or previous grade levels. Now, pag nakuha mo yon, syempre doon papasok yung prerequisite. Doon siya papasok under prerequisite level. Pero ano nga ba yung progressing? Yung progressing is somewhere between the proficient and the prerequisite. Meaning, yung proficient kasi describes the expected competence dun sa milk mismo na ituturo ninyo. Okay? Yung progressing tells us the level of competence na almost there but not yet. Okay, so this is something that you will have to infer, based on your own understanding of the competencies and the curriculum standards. Okay, so again, proficient, yung expected mastery. And then, of course, your advanced describes the competence above what is expected. So wag lang kayo mag-focus dun sa, okay, tuturo ko ngayon etong competency na to. Kailangan mag-look ahead din kayo. You have to consider also the possibility na ma-master agad siya ng bata. So how can you, or what sort of activities can you provide to push your students further, no? Or move themselves further beyond the expected mastery. So ito yung advanced na level. Okay? So again, pag sabing advanced na level, this is not a new topic. Pero deeper lang, no, or wider lang, no, yung level of difficulty, no, or cognitive rigor na gusto mong ma-attain, no, for that certain competency. Okay? So together, the curriculum summary table and the teaching and assessment blueprint must go hand in hand, no? Again, my apologies if the example is too ano, no, parang masyadong maliit, no, yung font size para sa inyo. But again, what I'm just trying to emphasize is when you design, no, your lessons, and if you really want to make sure that that instruction is effective, kailangan sa planning stage pa lang na consider nyo ng mabuti yung prerequisites and also yung mga later competencies na connected, no, yung target competency ninyo para mailatag nyo into different levels yung inyong mga activities. Now, what are these levels for? Itong prerequisite, progressing, proficient, saka advanced. Again, ang gamit nito is para ma-identify ninyo anong klaseng activities yung pwede nyong maset. Kasi baka mamaya yung isang mahirap nyo na activity, baka masyado na siyang advanced, pero yung mga students nyo pala ay nasa progressing pa lang. Or maybe they're still at the prerequisite level and yet your activities already fall, no, sa proficient and the advanced, no. So again, magiging frustrating yun sa mga bata. They will have difficulties attaining the expected mastery. They will or their self-esteem might be lowered, no, kasi nakikita nila na kahit na sa anong activity they're failing, there's not enough support being given to them. So at least when these levels are clear to you, when you have this teaching and assessment blueprint, you can definitely identify the types of activities that you will design for your students, and also the expected responses, no, or the anticipated responses rather, no, that you might get from out of these tasks. Okay, so in light of the current setup, again, hindi na kahit sabihin natin increasing, no, yung number of schools, no, na nagka-conduct na ngayon ng face-to-face classes, hindi ibig sabihin niya na mawawala, no, ang distance learning. Okay, please take note that distance learning will really be here to stay na. Okay, lalo pa ngayon, no, na there's no sign of COVID-19 really being eradicated or mawala talaga, no. So definitely it's yung current situation natin calls us to rethink, no, teaching, learning and assessment, no, in ways that have never been taught before, no. At yun basically ang nag-push sa atin, no, nung 2020 at ngayong 2022 na and beyond. Kailangan maisip natin na paano pa magpapatuloy, no, yung mga changes, no, sa classroom setups natin. So at present, ito yung existing, no, na mga distance learning models natin dito sa Philippines, and may iba't ibang variations pa nga yan, eh. Diba? But aside from this, from these distance learning models, we now have to consider the possibility of implementing high flex learning in the new normal, if not in the next normal. Now, what do we mean by high flex, no, or high flex learning? So, of course, it's a word play, no, or combination siya ng hybrid and flexible learning. Of course, yung hybrid component niya consists of the integration of complementary face-to-face and online learning experiences, okay? Online learning asynchronous rather experiences. And as for flexible learning component, providing students choice in how they participate and engage with material in the mode that works best for them. And so, in a high flex learning setup, there are actually three pathways, no? Participation in face-to-face synchronous class sessions in person. That means in a physical classroom, okay, like this. Okay. And then second, participation in face-to-face class sessions via video conferencing or via video conferencing platforms like Google Meet or Zoom or whatever platforms pa na ginagamit. So, ito. Okay. And then, of course, participation fully asynchronously via LMS. Okay. So, again, in a HiFlex setup, pwedeng tatlong sabay-sabay yan. No? So meron kang students na nasa classroom mismo, meron kang students na nasa physical classroom rather. You have students who are in the online classroom or joining you online rather. And then you have students in the online classroom via LMS. So ang tanong ngayon dyan, how will you facilitate formative assessment in such a setup? No, in the physical classroom, those in the LMS, and those who are joining online. How will you facilitate these interactions with three different groups of students in your class? Okay, so in a HiFlex learning setup, we consider these three core values. Of course, number one is learner choice, kasi ngayon doon yung flexible learning. Kailangan may choice yung bata saan niya gustong sumali. Physical classroom ba? Sa LMS ba or online synchronous, no? Pero kung ano man yung maging choice niya, dapat yung experiences na makukuha niya from these three pathways should be equivalent to each other. So kailangan kahit na mag-join siya sa LMS, yung quality ng interaction, no, yung quality engagement niya dun sa material sa LMS should be equivalent to the quality of interactions in a synchronous class session in a physical classroom or in an online platform. Okay? And of course, reusability no, ng mga materials na meron din. And then lastly, accessibility. Okay? Those who will be joining in the online synchronous session via a video conferencing application or app. Pinili ng student yon, pero ang tanong, meron bang siyang enough na access no, to these technologies? Alam niya ba yung mga functions itong mga to? Yung magfo-fully asynchronous via LMS, are the materials accessible enough no, to these students? Okay, so again, merong ano dito, kailangan i-consider dito yung technological divide. Okay? And so, if the students cannot really participate well no, doon sa isang pathway or sa isang mode, then it might be best for the students to be joining in an in-person class session. So again, yung choices sa mga students, no, saka syempre kasama din dito yung parents, no, so kung dapat isama rin sila sa decision-making process, no, we'll have to take note of these core values or we'll have to take note of these important principles, no, to for this HiFlex learning setup to be much more effective when the time comes na ito na talaga yung gagawin in our schools. But again, I will still raise no, the crucial question of the importance of formative assessment. How can you assess your students formatively in such a setup? So, just like what I raised previously, it's important to look ahead no, into the future and think about what the future is going to look like in terms of teaching, learning, and assessment. Even when we completely, let's say 100% nakabalik na sa mga schools at talagang nagkakaroon ng mga face-to-face classes at lahat na ng mga students talaga ay nakabalik na no, sa mga schools. Let us not forget all the learning experiences no, that we have garnered, no, that we have attained no, nitong past 2 years. Okay? And so using these experiences, we have to think about what lies ahead in the future. Take note that we're talking about the new normal, but kapag nag-normalize na ito, this new normal will also become the old normal. And so by thinking further ahead, we need to continue reimagining, we need to continue rethinking no, ano ba yung mangyayaring situation later on. No? Kasi again, pa naging old normal na ulit, yung new normal, no? If that's sufficient to say, then kailangan tingnan natin ano ba ulit yung magiging next normal, and the next and the next. And of course, as we try to think ahead, no, we need to think about what sort of changes will happen in teaching, learning, and assessment, and how we can adapt to these changes. All right. So it's vital that at this in this very unpredictable times, no, teachers must not adhere to adhere to principles and practices na nakakahon lang, no, principles and practices that they have been applying for the longest time, na nagkulang na siguro, no, tayo ng reflection kung talaga ba nag-work ito, and it took the pandemic, no, for us to really think about what we need to do, no, for our students so that they can learn better. So whether distance learning yan, or in-person learning, or high-flex learning, we must start looking at teaching, or we must start thinking about teaching as a design science. And when we think about teaching as a design science, definitely we cannot do everything on our own. We have to engage in iterative cycles of teacher collaborative inquiry. In other words, we have to start collaborating with our colleagues, with our teachers. Okay? And when I say collaboration, it's not just limited to, well, let's write a lesson plan, or you do this and that. That's not the collaboration that I'm talking about here. When we say collaborative inquiry, you're trying to determine ano ba yung mga learning gaps ng mga bata, and how can we design our lessons better so that we can better address these learning gaps. How can we better design assessment tasks so that we can gather better information, no, about our students' performance. And so whatever lesson, or whatever task, or whatever resource that you come up with, or that you innovate, make sure that you test, no, these ideas. Then after testing, you reflect, no? You reflect on your own, and then you reflect as a group, no? Let's say you have a group of 3 teachers, no? So you reflect on your own, and then you share, no, yung mga learnings with each other. And then once you are able to identify kung ano yung, let's say, what went well, what needs to be improved, you try to redefine again, no, your plan. You try to redo, no, yung ginawa ninyo, and then you apply that again, you test, you reflect, and then you share. And then when you're comfortable enough, no, kapag nakita nyo marami na kayo nakuhang experiences, and you feel you are confident enough, no, about sa ginagawa ninyo, then you can now share these experiences with other groups of teachers within the school, or maybe later on with other groups of teachers in other schools. Okay? So this is what we mean, no, by teaching as a design science. So I think it's time to move on, no, from the practice of just waiting for available lesson plans, no, to come to us, and then for us to copy lang, no, and then i-implement lang natin kung ano yung gustong gawin as stated, no, do sa lesson plan na yun. Again, every teacher handles a different set of pupils. Okay, and so your lessons, the learning experiences that you will design for your students must be tailored to the needs of your students. Okay, and so the only way that you can do this is, of course, by being cognizant, no, of the evidence that you have about student learning, and then you combine that with the best available research out there about how you can teach a certain discipline more effectively, and then also by collaborating with teachers, because by collaborating you'll get to to maximize, no, or optimize yung competencies nyo as teachers, no. So whatever the weakness is sa isang teacher, mapupunan nyo ng ibang teachers. So that's what we mean really by collaborative inquiries, no, in designing teaching and learning experiences. All right. So let me just end this session with these two statements. So always remember that education is everyone's responsibility. Okay, I know it's been hard, no, especially for teachers and definitely maging sa mga school heads na rin, no, to run a school, no, or to conduct or facilitate instruction rather from a distance. Definitely hindi yun madali. Okay? And so this pandemic really highlighted, no, the crucial role of everyone in the school or everyone in the education system just to make sure that learning continues, no, despite these uncertain times. And now that again many of the schools, more than 50% of the schools here in the Philippines have already opened, and millions of children have already participated, no, on in-person learning. Then the more, no, na maging dapat mas ano tayo, cognizant tayo sa kung ano pa yung mga factors na dapat ma-cover natin just to make sure that nami-meet natin, no, or natutulungan natin yung mga estudyante natin to meet their learning targets. Okay? And so we always have to keep our doors open to innovation and collaboration. And this is what I emphasized in the previous slide, no. If we, I don't know, siguro from a futures thinking perspective, we really have to make sure that we continuously innovate and collaborate, no, so that we can find new ways, no, of engaging our students, no, and then maybe these new ways will eventually help us provide solutions, no, for whatever issues that we are encountering relative to learning outcomes, right? So I hope that this session has been productive, no, for everyone. And again, no, kung may mga questions kayo, wag niyo lang kalimutan na i-comment, no, yung mga, or i-type, no, yung mga questions niyo dun sa comment section dun sa ating Facebook page. Okay, let me just check now kung may mga questions dito. Okay, so far wala pa ako nakikitang questions. I hope that's a good thing. But again, kung meron man kayong mga questions dito, especially kung sa mga makakapanood pa nito later, just feel free to type in your comments or your questions in the comment section. All right? At syempre, huwag niyo kakalimutan na i-like at i-share itong episode natin, no, para kasi so far nakita ko nasa 30 plus lang, no, on average yung nandito. So baka busy pa yung marami. So again, paki-share na lang itong episode so that they can still view this later, no, in their free times. Okay? So kung may mga questions man kayo, well, you can just post your questions in the comment section, or if not, you can always send your key takeaways and also your questions through my email address at josephrandoff.palattao@depe.gov.ph. So with that, maraming salamat sa inyong lahat. Muli, ako po si Joseph Randolph Palattao, PNU B.Ed Batch 2007. Sana magkita-kita tayong muli. Maraming salamat.